Yeah, well, actually, one thing I did pick up from my doing my first episode. I don't know if you had a chance to listen, but
I did. I liked it a lot.
I didn't like the intro. What did you feel about it? I felt it was too forced.
Yeah, I think that was honestly my only feedback. But, just think it back to when we first started doing it too. I feel like a lot of the things we did were very forced. And then we sort of flipped the switch on that and said, you know what, like we don't want to be another podcast that feels overly scripted, overly forced. Like we just want to have like a free flowing conversation. Because at the end of the day, those are the best types of conversations when people actually just speak freely with what's on their mind. So we really tried to adopt that with our intros too.
Well, I mean, as I said, I don't really like. I'm gonna cut the intro. That's the first thing I'm gonna do. So I'm gonna introduce you now. It is Kristian. Let me know if I get this right. Borghesan.
You got it right.
All
You got it.
right. I'm always afraid there. Director of Marketing at Savology, and also the co-host of the Art of the Fail podcast, which is the main reason I wanted to get you on here so we could chat about podcasting and kind of reaffirm what I'm doing right here and
Definitely.
what's pick your brain of how to do it properly and what kind of success you've seen with it. So the first question I have written here, at least that we'll start with as a basis, is was your first podcast and kind of what got you interested in it?
Yeah. Is that, sorry, you mean like the first podcast I've listened to, or the first one that we created?
I was gonna say creative, but let's start with listen to. What got you interested in podcasts?
That's, yeah. Yeah, why not? Let's start with that. Funny enough, I'm actually not even really like a big podcast listener, which is kind of ironic as someone who hosts a podcast. But from what I can recall, at least pretty vividly, the first podcast I think I maybe not necessarily listened to, but really got hooked on was Serial when they first came out
Mm.
with that first season, and I think that would have been around, I forget the exact time frame, anywhere from like 2010 to 2012, somewhere around there, I think.
Has it really
Um,
been that long? Wow.
it has been that long, I know. And so that was kind of what got me introduced and hooked on podcasts. I just thought it was a really cool way to absorb a lot of content that was, kind of checked off a lot of different boxes. It was educational, it was insightful, it was something you could pick up and go and just sort of do on your own time. And also, it was very entertaining, and I was really struck on how well produced a podcast could be by listening to that. Now, obviously, most of the people that are producing podcasts are not fortunate enough to have the production behind them that Serial was, and that's totally okay. I actually do prefer things that are not overly produced, to be completely honest. So that was the first podcast I would say that I listened to, and the first podcast that I created was The Art of the Fail. I co-host that with a good buddy of mine, Chris Buttonham, who's the founder and CEO of a company called Obi.ai. And it was kind of an interesting way on how Chris and myself kind of came together and started that podcast. So we had been friends for a little while before that, and both of us being just very fascinated in startups, entrepreneurial journeys in general, and just really learning from other people in their own experiences. We sat down and we said, okay, what is something that, if we wanted to start a podcast, what is something that we could talk about that not many people are currently talking about right now? Maybe it's just something that they don't feel will resonate with a lot of people, even though there might be opportunity to, or maybe it's something that some people are fearful of mentioning. And so failure came to mind immediately. Both of us being big proponents of learning through failures, as both of us have a lot of failures under our belts. And so that's just kind of how everything transpired with starting up The Art of the Fail. And then one thing led to another. We started filming and recording and putting out our first couple episodes. And right now we just chunk them in different seasons. A season makes up, anywhere from 8 to 10 episodes, depending on the interest we get from guests, which is quite high, actually. We do get a lot of people just cold emailing us asking to come on the show themselves, but we've got a bit of a strict criteria now that we've got a few under our belt. So we don't really like to open it up to just anyone and everyone. Being a show about failure, we really try to vet people ahead of time that actually have, I would say, larger than normal type of failures that kind of have a bit of a wow factor, but that you can also actually learn from. So, we don't want people on the show that are just coming on and saying, oh, I failed the test, or, oh, like a marketing campaign failed. Like, it has to be something that really sinks in and makes your jaw drop, almost like, I lost millions of dollars of my investors' money by bad hiring mistakes or things like that. Yep.
What has been the biggest failure that you've come across on the show?
Oh, that's a good one. I would say that, actually. We had our first guest, Tom Hanfield, really, really, really cool guy. Awesome and very interesting conversation. And yeah, I mean, he opened up and he sort of set the bar pretty high with the fails to come on next. And it was that he lost, I forget how many millions, but several $1 million of investor money. And he was just sort of taking us through that journey, and sort of even like the emotional burden that he was feeling, knowing that he was responsible for that cash flow and for the loss of that money. And I think he actually stated to his investors, when he had to mention to them that the company's no longer, we're going under, there is no money left. I think he ended up making a promise to those investors that he would eventually pay them back to some sort of degree, which he actually did end up doing. So good for him.
Gonna check out that episode now.
Yeah, please do. Let me know what you think.
And for you, what would you say has been the impact on your personal branding, hosting a podcast?
I think overall it's been a pretty positive impact. I think just being able to have, like we're doing right now, just sit down and kind of get to know each other on a whole different level. Other than, like, you and myself, we've had a bunch of different conversations, whether it's over LinkedIn or Instagram even, or email. But I mean, now being able to actually sit down and sort of dive deeper into each one of our own stories is a really cool way to make a better connection with people. And the outcome of that is that people start looking at you as someone who is able to competently and confidently have conversations with amazing leaders in their own industries. And so when people look at you as someone who is a great communicator and someone who is able to help people tell their own story and portray that and distribute that type of content, I think people start to trust you more. They really want to hear more from you. And that's definitely something that I've noticed from doing my own show, for sure. And now I would say, like, we really don't even outreach to people anymore to come on the show unless they're really, really, really big names that, it's someone that we've been wanting to get on the show for quite some time. Then we'll, continually follow up with them. But a lot of the time, like, we have people just volunteering to come on the show, which has been quite remarkable.
How long do you think it took to get to that point where people were coming to you?
I would say it took, if I could ballpark it, a good year. I'd say after the first year, people started to really pay attention to what we were doing, and take interest into the type of content that we were putting out there. Season 1 was kind of like anything else that you do. You put out content, you've got a certain format that you stick to, you've got certain questions that you ask in a particular flow with the show. It was definitely all trial mode. And so season 2, we definitely cut a lot of the fat in. I definitely wouldn't go as far as to say perfected the show, because it's got a lot of improvements still, but we definitely made some major improvements. And I think it was then when people started listening to the updated version of the structure and the format that people were like, wow, this is a really cool show. And, I've got a couple things that I can add that not only, maybe I want to get myself out there, but I've got a really cool story that I can tell that will hopefully help someone else who might have been in my shoes 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Do you mind mentioning what some of those improvements were or lessons learned from the first season?
Yeah, so Chris and myself are very on the fly type of guys. And so what we did is the first season, we tried to constrict ourselves a little bit too much, knowing that we don't necessarily operate in that sort of way. So it didn't really come across as natural as we'd like to. So we
Hmm.
definitely changed that up on season two. But we also made sure that every guest coming on season two and beyond, that we had done at least a little bit of research ahead of time, because that was Chris is a lot better than I am. I'm definitely like a very, or I can be a very last minute type of guy with those things in particular. And so I like to cram it in, but we made sure that both of us did, enough research to the point where we had at least a good understanding, or thought we had a good understanding of who the guests were. But it also helps. It helps with the types of questions that you want to ask. So even though you want the conversation to flow very naturally, it doesn't take the conversation like way too off course. You've got what we like to call them anchor questions, where if it's going a little too off course, we can throw an anchor question and reel them back into that that path that we want to take them along. That was one major improvement. The second one, I know Chris made a bunch of adjustments just on the production side of things, so improving the audio quality, making a couple different changes with how things were being edited afterwards. Um, we added video, which this. Yeah, and we were actually talking about this a little bit earlier. We added video to the show, which I think is a really cool element. But as I was telling you, it's also one of those things where it adds a lot more to your plate, to your work,
Hmm.
not only just in the production and post production, but even the distribution of the content itself. And so, I would say video is doing quite well for us, but we're definitely still getting a lot more listens to the audio by far than we are to the amount of video views that we're receiving. And so, whether or not that's been something that has been beneficial for us, it's kind of hard to tell, but we're sort of at a point where we have committed to it. So we'll keep going. We'll keep
Yeah.
going with video. Yeah. So those are just a few changes that we've made.
Where do you distribute the video?
Just on YouTube, and then we'll just share it all across social media channels. We'll send out some emails. Just pretty low hanging fruit type of distribution.
Yeah, I imagine it's pretty good to get new listeners, but I'm not someone who would go to YouTube to listen to someone. I'd maybe find them on YouTube and then jump over to Spotify and listen to them there.
Yeah. You know what, I don't know. I mean, when you think about, and I think that's what I was talking about is when you think about how people consume podcasts. A lot of people like listening to, whether it's a show or an episode of a show. You like listening to it in the comfort of your own home. You like being able to listen to it when you're on the go. Maybe you're driving somewhere. Maybe you're commuting. Maybe you're at the gym. And so when you add video into the mix, it kind of convolutes a lot of that. It's a great way to diversify the content and add another element to the show, but it can also be very distracting in the outcome of the goal that you want to achieve with the show as well. And one of the other things too is you always have to realize, as you're filming video and recording the audio at the same time, you want both of those, the listeners and the viewers, to have a very similar type of experience. And sometimes when you're recording on video, there's a lot of contextual things that take place that maybe someone listening to the audio might not really interpret or understand, because maybe you're showing like a physical prop, let's say, for example. So just some things that you have to be very mindful of.
Hmm. I mean, I think the video aspect is really good to kind of splice up for promo materials as well, like 10-minute clips to throw on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
There's definitely benefits, but also going through and splicing that up takes a lot of time. So maybe I'll do it down the track.
Yeah. I would definitely caution video until you're absolutely ready for it.
Yeah, I did want to ask. So we did talk about personal branding, and it's been a success for you. Um, do you have you found it's limited your brand at all as well, though? Because I used to work for a magazine, and I would go to events and write up stories and people kind of saw me as a journalist, even though I was actually the digital manager for the magazine. So I'm just wondering if you've had any issues with that as well, where people might just see you more as a journalist or an interviewer. rather than a
Yeah,
marketer?
that's a really good question in a unique one too. I mean, I'd love to hear about that experience of yours, maybe, offline. But personally, I haven't seen that happen to me, and I think, maybe the reason why could be, I could be totally wrong with this, but just the types of guests that we're bringing on. Like, we always do try to bring on guests that have very uh, different backgrounds and have a lot of different value in their own way to bring to the show. So we really just try to diversify the content by bringing on different types of guests. So that's one way where we don't necessarily want to pigeonhole ourselves into, bringing on, let's say, just strictly fintech founders or something like that. But yeah, not that I can recall. I think it's been pretty positive all across the board for sure.
Hmm. And do you have any best practices on how to grow the audience?
The biggest things for us have been asking. So after we publish the episodes and start to distribute them, emailing our guests, letting them know that the show or the episode, sorry, is live, and sending them not only a link or a personalized link that they can use to distribute, but also some content as well for them to share with their networks. And most of the time, there is like, everyone's on board pretty much. Like, if you
Hmm.
had a good interview with people, like, for sure they're gonna help you share the content that is featuring them essentially. And so for the most part, everyone has been on board. And the other thing too is not only getting the buy-in from the guests, but also asking for reviews and getting reviews has been really pivotal for us. I would even say we've noticed that when we put an effort into getting ratings and reviews across the different, let's call them directories like iTunes and Google Podcasts and such like that, that our subscribership and the downloads has increased significantly. So that was something that when we started noticing that, we started putting in a little more effort towards there, just to hopefully organically grow the show that way.
Hmm. So if everyone could subscribe and review, that would be great.
Exactly. Subscribe and review
Once I
today.
get on Apple, I'm still waiting on Anchor for that one.
Oh, you know what? With yeah, with my other podcast, which I really don't do anything with, I noticed that too on Anchor. It took a while for me to get on iTunes, but it did happen. So
Yeah,
it
it
will
says
happen.
10 days, so I'm just being patient with it.
Yeah, I guess that's all you can be right now. Just
Yeah,
sort of sit back and wait.
yeah. Do you have any tools that you recommend? I know you had used Anchor in the past.
Yeah, this one's a funny question for me because even with our show, I don't really do any of the we'll call it the producer role in the show. I leave that one up entirely to Chris, which I'm sure he's super fascinated about. Mind you, he did volunteer, but I know he uses GarageBand. We ended up hosting our podcast on SoundCloud. For us, the first show that we ended up doing, it just happened to be the easiest lift for us to get a show up. But now that I came across Anchor, and again, that's something that you and I have gone back and forth on. I love Anchor, so I would definitely recommend, if anyone listening to your show and to this episode in particular is interested in starting a podcast themselves, whether it's just for experimental purposes, maybe it's something that they're tasked to do at their job, maybe it's part of a side hustle that they want to do. I would definitely recommend trying out Anchor just for the ease of access to everything alone.
Hmm. And what do you use that for recording, or
I
do you
use
use
that.
another program?
Yeah, no, I use that for recording, for distribution, pretty much for everything, actually.
Hmm. The only issue I had with Anchor was not being able to see the person. It's purely through doing it through your phone, which I didn't quite
Exactly.
want.
Yeah. Yeah. So
uh,
actually, that's a really good point. I would say, if you're if your show has guests coming on, then maybe recording through Anchor might not necessarily be the best way of doing it. That second show that I started is literally just me rambling on, so maybe I wouldn't necessarily recommend anyone listen to that. But yeah, if it's just you talking about some stuff that you're interested in or that you're an expert in, then Anchor could be
Ooh.
good.
You kind of alluded to it earlier, but what have you learned about interviewing people and the best way to do it? And I guess how prepared do you go in uh, to interviewing people?
Yeah, like I was saying, like I once upon a time when we first started, I would completely wing it going into it. And I realized that, as great as that is, as being able to have a completely free flowing, natural conversation, you sort of um, unravel a lot of parts of those people's journey as you go. Being prepared, at least to some extent, does help you with those, as I called them earlier, anchor questions. And it also just helps sort of set the tone and the expectation for the interview and for the episode itself. So now I try to do, at least anywhere from half hour to an hour of research on any one of the guests. So maybe that's, I'll go and I'll check out their LinkedIn profile. I'll see what they've been up to. I'll see what other jobs they've done, what their career path has looked like. I'll check out their where they got their degree from, if they ended up going to post-secondary school. If they're authors, I'll check out what books they've written. If they are podcast hosts themselves, I'll check out what shows they host. So really just any little bit of additional context you can get about the person definitely does go the mile. With that in mind too, I'm not the type of person that would go and completely analyze the person's entire life. I know there are people that might, put a good 4 or 5 hours into researching. I think Chris is kind of going that route, but it's something that works for him. And so I would say, just do a little bit of research ahead of time, just so you feel even a lot more at ease and comfortable when you do have the person either on video or just on call with you. And the other bit is about interviewing. What I've learned about interviewing in general is just, it's like the old adage and the phrase, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, just sort of use them in those proportions. And that is absolutely true. So you being the interviewer, it's so critical to, allow the person that you're interviewing to tell their story, just knowing that you also have control on how you can sort of steer that. But just, letting them tell their story, because at the end of the day, they're on your show for a reason.
Mm-hmm. I will say I do find this format a lot easier to engage and listen with people compared to the panel discussions, where usually at the time I'm actually like looking at my phone to check the time, just checking and engagement with people. So I don't have to think about that. So this is kind of nice to just kind of chill and relax a little more. But
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, I
Yeah.
am wondering, like, I do have like written questions, but honestly, I could probably wing this a lot more than I can a panel.
Yeah. And that's exactly it, right? Because you'll realize when your guest starts speaking, like, and I'm sure this has probably happened to you in this episode already. Like, there's probably, 10, maybe even more questions that might have popped it up in your mind. You're like, wow, I could really ask Kristian something about that, something about that, something about that. So it's really, it's cool just, if you listen closely, the little bits of pieces that you can extract and leverage those.
Hmm. So I did want to ask you about your last job and how you got it through the podcast.
Hmm.
Do you want to go in a little bit to that story and how that happened?
Oh, so with Planswell.
Yeah.
Yes. So I had Eric Arnold, who was the CEO of Planswell. I guess Planswell ended up starting up again, so he's still the CEO of
I did
Planswell.
it now. No idea.
Yeah, so they're just operating under a different corporate name, I
Okay.
believe. I'm not really too sure of the exact business model, but I do know that Planswell is giving it another kick of a can. And, to be honest, I hope things go very well for them. They're all extremely intelligent guys. And there's definitely a need for something like that. So I don't really know too much about the current operation, but yeah, I ended up getting my job. I would definitely attribute it to the podcast. So I had Eric Arnold, the again, sounds weird saying former slash current now again CEO of Planswell, on as episode 10 on our first season as a guest, and we had a great conversation with Eric. I mean, he's got a pretty fascinating background He's done a lot of different startups in the past, and he's really an idea guy that just loves experimenting and trying different things. And he's super brilliant and super smart and good at executing on them. And so I think it might have been maybe 4 or 6 months after that episode. Things with the company that I had started weren't really quite going, overly well, I would say. And I just wasn't pleased with how things were going. And I felt it was time for me to change up what I was doing in my career. So I reached out to Eric, mentioned to him how things were going on my end. And I had just asked, like, are you guys hiring at all? And sure enough, one thing led to another. And then I got in there, got a couple interviews, and then I landed my role there as the marketing manager at Planswell. And so I was there for about just shy of a year and a half.
Just switching gears a little bit, you did just mention Planswell had kind of folded, I think in November.
Yep.
You kind of went crazy then. I saw on LinkedIn you were posting a ton. You started a second podcast. Is there any words of advice you would have for someone who, like, obviously a lot of people might be finding themselves in that situation themselves?
Yeah. The adage in the phrase, your network is your net worth, totally rings true in situations like that when you do need that support. And it's great to have a support system. So for anyone who is, going through any sort of challenging or turbulent time with their career, whether, it's sudden unemployment, and I know there's a lot of people that are experiencing this currently. So, I definitely feel for them because I was recently in their situation, and it's tough. I would say never be shy to ask questions or to ask for help. You've worked this hard building up and maintaining relationships with people that are very supportive, with people that they themselves may have been through these similar situations, which they themselves may have, a network behind them who are more than capable and willing to support. So don't be afraid and don't shy away from asking a question if it means it can really help you out. Your support system is there in times like this to help you out. And so that would be my piece of advice. Obviously, the other side of that is, you always want to be cautious of abusing those types of support systems. So it's definitely both a give and take relationship. But yeah, at the end of the day, your network is your net worth, and it rings true, especially in times like these.
And you seem to have a knack for falling forward. You went from a marketing manager to a director of marketing position.
Yeah.
And I remember when we spoke, because I reached out to you when I saw Planswell had folded, and you said you wanted remote. And I was like, wow, you're being really specific and you got it. Like, is that the key? You just like look for what you really, really want and don't take a second option?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because I was in a weird situation where, and it's funny, you had mentioned that at that time I was putting out a lot of content. I think I just had a lot of time on my hand, and I was like, you know what? I have been wanting to get back to the level of content production that I once was at before. And now that I have this time, I've got a lot more experience under my belt and a lot more things that I can share and add value to. So I just started pumping out content, and I think that started getting some eyeballs from people who were hiring as well. And so, yeah, I had something in my mind that was like, you know what, I still do live in Hamilton. I was working in Toronto. The commute was about 2 hours door to door one way. So I was spending about 4 hours, either taking the Go bus or the Go train. And I would realize that, I'm not utilizing my time when I'm in my commute or during my commute. And so I'm really just like, I was sort of miserable most of the time going into work and leaving work knowing that I had to hop on a train. And I realized that it was definitely impacting my overall quality of life. It was impacting, my relationship with my friends, my family. It was impacting, my health overall. Just like by the time I got home, I didn't want to go to the gym. And so I realized that like, I did not want to commute after that. That was one thing that I made very clear. And you're right, we had talked about that. I was like, I absolutely do not want to commute. If I have to, sure, I'll do it, because at that point you are sort of in survival mode as well. But
Hmm.
I definitely made it a goal of mine to get a job that was remote. And so, luckily enough, Spencer, who's the CEO of Savology, and I had nothing but amazing things to say about him. The relationship, the working dynamic and relationship that him and I have is by far the best I've ever had with any leader, any senior manager, especially a CEO. He puts a lot of trust in me, and I think that helps me move the needle forward and helps me bring out my best work. But yeah, I made it a goal of mine to work remotely entirely. And then Spencer had reached out, and him and I just sort of had a couple conversations before anything was agreed upon in terms of, whether it was a consulting type of basis, which is what I started out as at first with Savology. And then, yeah, our relationship sort of developed from there. And then there just came up a point in the time when Savology needed to hire the marketing leader, the marketing director, and it just worked out well for me.
And is that a struggle, like being that high level and being remote?
I would say it's not necessarily a struggle. Like, for sure, I think there are times where if I was in the office, it would probably be a lot more efficient, or it might just be easier to ask a couple questions, whether it's to Spencer or Tim, who's our head of engineering. But I think we make up for it in certain ways, and what we do and what we have done very well from the get-go of me coming on and doing even part-time type of work with Savology when I first started out was we set very clear expectations on how the workflow and the communication style was going to be. And so just having that in place really helped how everything else around us transpired and how we do work. So for sure, I would say there are times where maybe having a personal one-on-one meeting might benefit us, but in times that we're living right now, at least I would say the for sure positive side of things is that we've been working remote for a while. At least I have with Savology, so I'm very accustomed to that. So our workflow hasn't been disrupted or changed much.
Yeah, and that's why I asked, because we're all doing it now.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I've got a couple months at least before the pandemic really hit, and that definitely helped.
Yeah. And I mean, with the current crisis, have you seen any kind of short term or anything you can kind of see predicting happening in the marketing world? I'm just kind of leaving this very general to pick your brain and see what you're seeing out there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I was, having a conversation with a good buddy of mine yesterday about that too. Just not even necessarily on the marketing front, just how the current times will enable or sort of force a shift in just the way we work and we communicate with others.
Mm,
And I think what we're seeing is that there are a lot of tasks that people in companies in general can do remotely. I think sometimes, a lot of times, it comes down to companies maybe having trust or having a lack of trust in their employees. A lot of companies try to attribute it to a culture thing, but which I totally get. But I also do think that you can still develop and build great culture remotely. And so I don't think that culture necessarily has to be something where when you're in the same room together. But what I will say is that this will definitely change the mindset for companies on how the working relationship and dynamic will be. So my friend he's in the entertainment, the film industry, and so he's a film writer, he's a producer, director, and they do table reading. So a table reading is when you have the script ready, you've got the casting done, and what people will do is they'll actually sit around a physical table. That's why it's called a table reading, and everyone will go through the script together, each cast member and actor reading out their parts. And so he was saying they actually had a virtual table reading a couple days ago, and he said it went 100 times better than he could have imagined. He said this is probably going to change how they're going to do table readings from now on, because you don't have to pay for actors or for any of the other cast members. Maybe it's producers, executive producers, etc., coming in physically to one location to read it. So he's like, it's saving a lot of time and money. And to be honest, the outcome is pretty much the same. Now that was his first one, so who knows if he'll say that on the second one that he does. But that's just one example, again, from something that is not necessarily related to marketing directly, but.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, even for me, like we're producing webinars right now, and it's getting our stakeholders used to just being in a room by themselves rather than like having the marketing team in there to hit record for them.
Yep.
Which means we can probably produce more because it's less effort now for us. And
Exactly.
it's going to be interesting. Even taking like sick leave from now on, I think I know I was always someone who like, I had to be really sick not to go in, but not anymore. Like I think that's going to be, change a lot of people's mindsets and behaviors. It's going to be really interesting to see where it goes.
Absolutely. Yeah, it'll be interesting because it's still definitely in its infancy stages right now on how things are developing. But, for sure, we can already start to see a couple of trends start to emerge out of this on how, the new, let's call it the new norm, might be coming out of this when we eventually do. But, it's still really early right now. So it's kind of hard to predict exactly what things will look like when we eventually get to that new norm.
Mm-hmm. And short term, are you doing anything in your role? Maybe switching where your budgets are going or anything along those lines?
Yeah, what we're trying to do now, one of the things is we're really placing more of an emphasis on diversification of how we're spending our money and how our efforts are going towards. So instead of leading with maybe 2 or 3 of the stronger channels, we're trying to get ourselves out there in more channels. And I think that's something that you should definitely do anyways. Naturally, we were going to do that just at the stage of the company anyways, now being in growth mode and scale mode. But I think with everything that's happening, it's more apparent now than ever that, diversifying how you're, creating your demand or driving your leads is really more critical than ever. And I would also say on that point, just it shows too that marketers, we really have to be empathetic and lead with, keeping in mind that anyone we're marketing to is a human on the other side of the screen. So whether we're in B2C or B2B, really you're marketing to a human being. And so in times like these, that becomes at the forefront.
Yeah, some great points. I think we can leave it there. Thanks for the conversation today. Where can people find your podcast?
Awesome. So you can find our podcast at our website is theaotf.com. And pretty much anywhere else, just type in The Art of the Fail podcast and you can find us.
All right. Thanks for being on the podcast, Kristian.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Appreciate it.
All right, I guess I have been recording, but I don't know where I could start this, to be honest, because like half the stuff we talked about, I could edit out.
I love it. Hey, by all means, you know what? If you want to use that, I find honestly some of the best content is the stuff that you record before you even know, or before the guest even knows that you're actually recording, and even at the end of the episode, sometimes you just reveal the best nuggets. That's honestly what Chris and myself do on our episodes. Sometimes is we like to use those as some sort of like teaser type of material that we can market, or somehow we throw it into the episode because it just ends up being way better content sometimes.